and do a quick, might not be quite, but to do a bit of a review over, to keep an eye on what it is that we're looking to, work ourselves towards. I was watching the live stream of Father Oleg last session. He spoke a lot about circumcision, quite a bit. In fact, an uncomfortable amount of circumcision, and it reminded me that when I was in the seminary in Rome, during Lent we'd have table reading. So instead of, at lunchtime just having ordinary conversation amongst ourselves, we'd have someone who would be reading some, sort of spiritual work, and we'd eat in silence. And because we were in Rome, we decided that it would be a lovely thing to read St. Paul's letter to the Romans. Because we're in Rome, Paul's writing to the Romans, it's as if Paul's writing to us. But there's a section there where he talks an uncomfortable amount about circumcision. So try and do that while you're eating lunch. It's we were sort of like glancing up from our plates to each other and having a little laugh from time to time. That it was Father Oleg reminded me of that. Okay, let's remember where we've been, and then hopefully that'll keep us on the right path to where we're headed. As I said, lots and lots of details. And lots of interesting details, but we shouldn't let these little details, sort of distract us to go down rabbit holes. We still need to remember where we're headed. And the overarching concept that we're looking at, and, the one kind of bridging theme which pulls together the Old and the New Testament idea of covenant. And perhaps it's helpful just to go over again what a covenant is and what a covenant does. First off, it's helpful to look at the distinction between a contract and a covenant. And hopefully, some of this is sort of sounding familiar from previous weeks. But if you remember, a contract is where two people come together and they promise by the strength of their own name, and often by signing their own name, a range of things. I'll give you this, you give me that, and that will fulfill our contract. It can be time, it can be labour, it can be, goods for exchange, whatever. And so contracts, they produce clients, customers, if you like. Covenants are a little bit different. Covenants is not so much where you exchange something, but where you exchange someone. That what comes about is a relationship of belonging, that I'm yours and you're mine. And so instead of creating clients and customers, what a covenant will produce are spouses, brothers, sisters, kin. Bonds of relationship, if you like. And instead of entering into a covenant by the strength of our own name, a covenant is established through an oath. I swear by one who is even greater than me. And in which case, what I'm putting on the line is not simply my name, my reputation. What I'm putting on the line is my whole life. That, when I swear by God's name, I'm putting my whole existence, if you like, on the line. My faithfulness will be governed by this promise which I've sworn in God's name. An oath, and not simply just a promise. That sounds familiar? Okay. Now, what we're going to see time and time again through the scriptures is that God establishes a covenant with his people, and very quickly after that, it's met with unfaithfulness. That what God is seeking to do is to unite, is to bring together into one communion, and over again, we're going to see this story of unfaithfulness unfold. And that creates problems, right? Because remember, when you swear something by oath, you've put yourself on the line, right? Which means that if you've broken faith, if you've broken this covenant bond, well, what do you lose? Yourself. You lose who you are. You lose what you are. And so in these broken covenants, there's this kind of absolute mess that gets created that needs a resolution, that needs to be cleaned up. That, we can't just wish these promises away. No, somehow we need to, something needs to be done to heal the covenant and restore the covenant. And that's where we're headed, right? That what God is going to do, he makes creation under the aspect of a covenant. It breaks. And now God is going to unfold throughout salvation history this saving plan, which is going to lead to Jesus and the new covenant, the new and eternal covenant. So that's where we're headed, right? So when we start talking about Adam and Noah and Abraham and Moses and David, and what we're seeing is the unfolding of God's plan to bring together his whole family. And what we see is it starts off small, starts off with Adam and Eve, and then it extends to Noah and his family, and then it extends out to Abraham and his tribe, and then it extends out to Moses and the 12 tribes which become a nation, and then it extends out to David and his kingdom. And all the while, this kind of expanding of the covenant, it feels at the same time like it's narrowing. Because now it's like, well, it's not those people, it's this people. Well, it's not those ones, it's these ones. It's not those ones, it's these ones. And Israel starts to get this identity of being the chosen ones, the people of the promise, the people of the covenant. We have this promised land, and it almost starts to feel like we have this promise and we have this God to the exclusion of everyone else. But in fact, what we discover is that what God is doing is he's creating, he's forming, he's shaping, he's molding this people to kind of be the firstborn of the family. The firstborn that's going to have this priestly mission and this kingly mission to gather the whole nation together, to gather the whole world. And that's what we find fulfilled in Jesus. That in actual fact, God, in choosing this people at this time, is precisely for the purpose of uniting all of creation, of bringing together all of God's family. There's no son or daughter of Adam or Eve, of Adam and Eve, that are left outside of God's promise. He's got a plan to pull them all together. So as we go through these covenants, right, we've got to see that God has this plan unfolding of bringing together the whole human family. It feels like it's getting bigger. At the same time, it kind of feels like it's getting smaller and smaller and smaller because, it's like, oh gosh, and now we're only talking about 2 tribes of Israel, and now we're only talking about, but God has designs on everyone, on the whole world. A couple of other little bits about covenants that I just want to kind of reiterate. We've spoken about this, but I think it's helpful. Firstly, the bond that is created, these family bonds, we need to understand them not as things which constrain our freedom, but actually things which allow us to be truly free and truly be ourselves. Bonds of freedom, if you like. Scott Hahn brought up an interesting little analogy. He said, well, marriage is a covenant, right? Well, marriage, because it is a bond and it is secured in the context of a promise of lifelong love, well, it means that a wife, she can grow old knowing that her husband's love isn't conditional on her beauty. And a husband is free to go bald and fat because our love isn't conditional on these aspects. It's actually grounded in this promise and oath. And that actually makes me free. I don't need to worry about the possibility of this bond now breaking because it's grounded in a promise and we keep our promises. Well, much the same now in this relationship between us and God. God is saying, look, these things aren't contingent. that these bonds are the very things that actually make us free and able to be who we really are. What is it that God wants for us? Yeah, to be honest, I think this is a question that we very rarely ask ourselves. What does God want for us? Typically, we would couch it in the terms of what does God want from us? Well, what do you want me to do, Lord? I want, what are the things that you demand of me? And I think that's grabbing the wrong end of the stick. I think we need to start off with, well, what does God want for me? How is it that he wants to love and to bless me? Well, he's going to make me capable of receiving his blessings. And as a consequence, there's going to be a certain way of me living that is going to make it possible for me to receive his blessing. If I'm living in a way that isn't in accord with God's kind of life and God's kind of love, it's going to make it very hard for me to accept that gift. What does God want for me? Well, he wants communion with me. And so I need to be made capable of that. We'll see this played out particularly tonight when Israel goes off into the wilderness, having come out of Egypt. And one of the things that we notice is that, okay, Israel needs to come out of Egypt, but Egypt has also got to come out of Israel, because a lot of Egypt, the Israelites are carrying around with them. And this 40-year process is going to be a 40-year wandering and purification of getting Egypt out of Israelites. Much the same with us. Well, what does God want for us? He wants the promised land for us, but you know what? Let go of Egypt. Let go of what's, in the past. And so we'll see that the law and this, bond, if you like, of the covenant is going to not constrain our freedom, it's going to point our freedom towards that place whereby we're able to truly enter into his blessings. That's why it's called a bond of freedom. Is that all right? Feels a little bit paradoxical to our modern sense, because basically we think if anyone's telling me what to do, I'm not free. It's like, yeah, but if your parent is telling you what to do, they're guiding you to the kind of life that you ultimately want, and to the kind of life that you are truly seeking and desiring. In which case, the rules of the household are not the thing that are going to stop you from being who you really are. They're the things that are going to promote and guide you towards who you really are. So there's that question. What does God want for us? Right? And I think this is why we're talking about covenants in the first place. Right? Because who is God? God is covenant. Just indulge me for a second. Go to page 36. The Trinity is the eternal covenant family. What is it that unites people as members of one family? Flesh and blood and a common name. Accordingly, the members of God's universal family, the church, are united in the sacrificial banquet we call the Eucharist, Christ's flesh and blood. And similarly, just as a common name unites a family, we as church are united through baptism, rebirth and adoption into God's family in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. The sacramental bond of baptism reflects a covenant oath which Christ has established as the new Adam, the founding father of this new family. We're going to talk about that in a couple of weeks. This bond is perfected and strengthened when we receive the flesh and blood of the Father's firstborn Son, the Passover lamb of the new covenant in the power of the Spirit. Thus, the Trinity is the eternal and original covenant family. As Pope John Paul II writes, God, in his deepest mystery, is not a solitude, but a family, since he has in himself fatherhood, sonship, and the essence of the family, which is love. That's the Holy Spirit, right? The Trinity is the eternal source and perfect standard of the covenant. When God makes and keeps covenants with his people, he's just being true to himself. In short, Covenant is what God does because covenant is who God is. From a sinful, shameful couple cast out of paradise to God's glorious, redeemed, worldwide family of saints at home forever in heaven, that miraculous transformation is the covenant story of the Scripture. That sets out the trajectory, right? So what's going to be at the heart? At the heart is going to be this regathering of what is scattered, a kind of re-covenanting, a re-establishing of communion. And why is this good? Because that's who God is. God is one, but not alone. God is one, but he is the eternal exchange of love between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The Trinity is covenant. And now, we who are made in God's image and likeness, we are going to be drawn together into covenant, into communion. A one flesh union, a communion of persons. Is that all right? I think this is how my crazy brain works. That if I don't have a sense of where we're going, I struggle to put the pieces together. Like I'll end up with like a handful of sand and it's like slowly slipping between my fingers. And in the end, I end up with like very little because, I've got to be able to put it together to be able to see the picture. Well, here's the picture. God is covenant. He creates creation in order to be in union with him. It breaks because of sin. And now we've got to put it back together again. And how are we going to do that? This is the unfolding of salvation history. Cool. Let me go through quickly Adam, Noah, Abraham, the ones that we've covered so far, just to make sure that we've sort of hit the highlights to see where we're going, right? Okay. So Adam, we started off by looking at that first account of creation. In the beginning, the world was a formless void, and God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Evening came, morning came, the first day. Second day, third day, fourth day, fifth day, sixth day, right? And all the while we're seeing creation unfolding according to God's plan and God's order. If you like, we start off with these sort of chaotic, stormy, dark waters, and now God is bringing order into the chaos. He's sort of putting a boundary to the chaos and he's allowing his creation, his order to come forth. And on the sixth day, God creates us. In his image and likeness, male and female, he created them. And he says of this that it is very good. All the other days are good. The sixth day, he looks at all that he has made and he finds it very good. And then on the seventh day, he rests. Now, is God resting because he's tired? Whew, that was, heavy week's work. No, it's not that, God has kind of hit his limit and like, gee, now I've really got to kick my feet up. This word 7 is the same as the Hebrew word for oath. So when you enter into an oath, you seven yourself. I severed myself. I entered into an oath. I entered into a covenant. God has created humanity on the sixth day. And now the very first day for us is the seventh. We have been created for covenant. We have been created for the Sabbath day. We've been created for relationship with God, to be in communion with him, right? That's what's being proclaimed to us. We then kicked into the second story of creation, right? That's when you start to get into Adam and Eve and all of that sort of stuff, right? And of course, we've heard this sort of repetitious litany. And when you read the scriptures out loud, you hear the sound and the resonances more than when you just read it on a text, right? But we've heard it was good, 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 it was very good. And then all of a sudden, when we hear about Adam, we find that Adam is alone. And God says, oh, this is not good. This is not good. Man isn't created for solitude. Man is created for covenant, for communion, right? So then we get this like parade of the animals, right? And Adam names all of these animals and says, nah, that's not me, nah, that's not me, nah, that's not me, nah, that's not me. And all of this time, through all of creation, he recognizes that, in fact, you know what? I am alone. I am alone. And so, God causes Adam to fall into a deep sleep, opens up his side, and then out of his side comes forth Eve. Now, remember what we're doing here, right? We're looking at the salvation history, and we're finding the ways in which it rhymes. What are these pictures that are going to help us to understand what Jesus is doing in his ministry and in his saving work, right? Okay, Adam asleep, side open, Eve coming from the side. Keep that picture and notice when Jesus is asleep on the cross, his side is pierced with a lance, and from his side come forth blood and water. Where is the church born? The church is born in the water of baptism and in the blood of the covenant, of the Eucharist. From his side is coming forward the new Eve, the new covenant, right? Okay, so notice where these rhyming patterns are coming forward. Okay. Adam wakes up and he goes, at last, this is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. This one will be called woman because she was taken from man. And there's a really beautiful expression that's given here by Scott Hahn. I just want to read it out to you because I read it and I loved it. Page 62, halfway down the page. His line, flesh of my flesh, bone of my bones, echoes the language of covenant solidarity used elsewhere in the scripture, and he gives a few references. Even more, it is the language of marital love and romantic ecstasy, heard for the first time at the dawn of history. What a glorious scene. Can you imagine a better opening to the family drama of salvation history? And this little piece of romantic poetry, like a prized family heirloom, has been handed down through the ages so that all of us, as Adam's descendants, might know how greatly beloved was our first mother. So, Adam wakes up, beholds Eve, and recognizes that he is now called to communion, a one flesh union. Now, here's the irony, right? Adam was one and alone, and it wasn't good. We now have Adam and Eve, two. And what's their vocation? To become one. But a one flesh union, which doesn't imply solitariness, aloneness, but a one flesh union which implies a communion of persons. And from that fruitful union of persons, what do we do? What do we receive? A third. So you go from 1 to 2 to 1 to 3. That what's expressed here is that Adam and Eve are both called to love, fruitful love. And this is why, Adam has this sort of ecstatic moment of realization. At last, this is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. Now at last, I make sense. I know what I'm for. I know what my life is, and I know what my life is for. I've been created in the image and likeness of God, and God is love. God is communion. God is covenant. Good. God's got some strange mathematics, as you can tell. Right. We then go into the temptations and the testing, right? Now, we started Lent with the story of Jesus' temptations in the desert. And the word tempting and testing is the same sort of thing. It's the same word, but it has a different sense, right? I remember when I was school, we've got teachers here. I remember when I was in school, when there was a test coming up, my teachers would say, look, don't worry, we're not trying to trap you. We're trying to see what you know. That a test would actually be revealing of what's in your head and what's in your heart. If you've been doing your work, the test is going to reveal it, right? We don't want you to fall over. We don't want you to trap you. We don't want to fail you. We want you to show yourself through the test. And I think it's perhaps this kind of sense that we need to understand Jesus testing in the desert. We're not looking for Jesus to fall over because, he's not going to. And just the same with Adam and Eve here, we're not looking for them to fall over here. Like, we're not hoping that, God isn't putting these hurdles in their path, to trip them up, but in fact to reveal what's truly contained in the heart. And I think the interpretation that Scott Hahn gives is very helpful because on the one hand, we look at the fall of Adam and Eve and we go, oh yeah, pride, wanting to make yourself God instead of being submissive to God. Pride and disobedience, we can see that everywhere. But the one that I think is sort of really instructive here as well is this reality that actually what we find is a failure to love. Because what are Adam and Eve supposed to do? They're supposed to love each other. They're supposed to protect each other, defend each other. Remember what mission Adam was given at the beginning when he was placed inside the garden. Well, you need to till and to keep. You need to cultivate the garden and you need to protect. They're the things that you need to do while you're here. That's your job, Adam. Well, in slithers the serpent, and we know the serpent's like, did God say that you couldn't eat of any of the trees? And Eve now speaks up and goes, no, God said that we could eat of all of the trees except, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We weren't even allowed to touch that one. And the interesting detail that Hahn points out here is that the serpent is actually speaking in the second person plural. It's like, did God tell you that you couldn't eat of any of these? And that implies that at this point, the serpent's actually addressing Adam and Eve together. They're both there. I mean, in English, it doesn't really come across because for us, the second person singular and the second person plural is the same. It's just you. But if, we use the Australian colloquial, the serpent would be saying, did God tell yous that you shouldn't be doing that? So you can kind of intuit that actually Adam's standing there. It's like, Adam, why aren't you defending Eve? Why are you letting her make the responses? Why are you letting her bear the brunt? Why are you allowing her to be the one who's tempted? Stand up. Be brave. Take up the mission that's given to you to keep, to protect. It's at this point that Hahn's like, you know what? We sometimes think that Eve was the one who fell first and then handed the apple to Adam. But actually, they're going down together. And there's the tragedy that in actual fact, what we're discovering here is fear and a failure to love. What don't I want to do? I don't want to sacrifice myself. There's this other bit where he sort of points out, he goes, okay, well, remember that the tree of life is in the middle of the garden? Well, why would the tree of life be there, if there was no possibility of death, if Adam and Eve are immortal? It's like, well, because the tree of life was there as a sign of the guarantee of God's loving protection. You know what? You can stand between the dragon and your bride, and you can let the dragon slay you and know that God will rescue you. That you can give, you can love to the point of self-gift. That's what Adam was being called to, right? Okay, remember how the scriptures rhyme? What is Jesus going to do? Where Adam fails in that faithful love, where Adam fails to protect his bride, where Adam fails to give his life and to contend with evil, what is Jesus going to do? He's going to enter into a new garden. He's going to enter into his agony, and he's going to be faithful to the end, right? What we're seeing here is where a covenant breaks and where a covenant is now being put back together. All right? Okay, good? Okay, right. Noah. From Adam and Eve, we then hear about Cain and Abel, then we hear about Cain and Seth, because Abel doesn't make it through, unfortunately. And we then see the way that family breaks. You end up with this massive split, and Cain has this, descendancy that are called the Cainites, and then Seth has this descendancy called the Sethites, and Seth's like trying to remain faithful to God and to live in covenant with him. The Cainites are just a disaster and an increase of violence, and we start to see polygamy come up, greater unfaithfulness to covenant love and all of that sort of stuff. And it all just turns into a real schmozzle. And in fact, the Cainites then start to infect the Sethites through intermarriage, and then it's just an absolute mess. And God's like, oh, you know what? I'm going to screw this page up, I'm going to throw it back, and we're going to start again. The flood is this return to the pre-creation state. Remember how the world was a formless void and there was darkness and there was ocean, and then God split the oceans and then land came forth? Well, he's letting the ocean come back. Wash it clean, wash it out, and we'll have this tiny little seed pod, an ark that has a little bit of everything of creation, and that's going to be our new start. And when it lands, it's going to break open and we're going to have a new beginning. And God then enters into a covenant with Noah that sounds a whole lot like the very covenant that he entered into with Adam. It's like, be fruitful, multiply, everything has been given to you, be faithful, all that sort of stuff. And so what we see is now this next set of expansion that goes from Adam and Eve, from this one little couple, to Noah's family and his 3 sons. An expansion of the covenant, if you like. What do we know about what happens after God makes a covenant with human, frail people? It breaks. Now, is God silly? Is he just begging for it? Like, why do you keep putting faith in these fallen human beings? Like, no. This is part of the plan. He knows how this is going to unfold. And in actual fact, in our repeated unfaithfulness, we start to see, in greater contrast, God's continued faithfulness. Now, think of it this way. If you've got a happily married couple, great husband, great wife, they love each other, wonderful. Well, we'll see a beautiful expression of abiding love, right? But what if one of them's a dirtbag? And the other one just keeps loving and loving and loving and loving and loving and loving. It's like, this is hard, but I'll forgive you. This is hard, but you know what? I'll stick by you. Well, what are we starting to see? The contrast is actually proclaiming the reality of the depth of love that this one spouse has got. Well, God is actually showing us, by our own unfaithfulness, the depth of his abiding love. Now, it's not kid glove kind of love. It's not, chocolates on Valentine's Day kind of love. It's tough because God wants us to be better. He wants us to grow. He wants us to be more. Remember, he's a father. But is he going to let us go? Is he going to abandon us? No, he's going to remain faithful to his promises, to his covenants. So we see that coming about with Noah. There's a lot to be said about Noah and how that break happens, but read the book, go back there. Right. Abraham, circumcision, all of that stuff. What we see with Abram, and it's a fascinating story, sort of see the way that it unfolds. We read it in the space of, several chapters, but in actual fact, it spans like decades. And God makes 3 promises to Abraham. And, you need to bear in mind that these promises, they don't come 1, 2, 3, straight away. They're extended over years and years and years of waiting and waiting and waiting. And lots of ups and downs and, oh my gosh, now there's a famine and now we're on the run and now we've got to go to Egypt and now we can come back. Like, there are lots of twists and turns. But all the while, Abraham's going, no, God will keep his promise. God will keep his promise. Which is why he's shown to be, the father of faith, the father of faithfulness, the father of trust, right? Okay, so remember there were 3 promises that were given to Abraham. 1, that he would be a nation. 2, that he would have a dynasty, that he would, that would be established in a kingdom. And then 3, that he would become a blessing, that his descendants would become a blessing to the whole world. So these 3 promises that God makes, God actually elevates to the level of a covenant, right? So God says, by my own name, because God can't swear by anything higher than himself, but he enters into that oath and he says, I will give this land to your descendants. I'll give you a nation, right? If you remember, that was on Sunday a couple of weeks ago. And, Moses, Abraham takes a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old goat, a 3-year-old ram, cuts them in half, splits the halves, and then has them sort of facing each other. And then, in his deep sleep, he sees a firebrand pass in between the halves of these animals. Now, you sort of go, what is that? That's just weird. And you know what? I'll give it to you at first glance. Yes, it's absolutely weird. But remember what's happening in a covenant. Well, for starters, remember that blood is thicker than water. We're not making contracts here. We're making covenants. We're making relationships of belonging. And that means we're blood brothers. And so that first aspect of seeing, the blood of these animals already proclaims the reality of what this covenant is really about. It's about us belonging to one another, of entering into kinship with one another. But there's also like a darker side to it, because you're also making a pledge. In the death of these animals, you're also sort of going, well, you know what? If I'm unfaithful to the covenant, may what has happened to these animals happen to me. Like, there's your pledge, there's your oath. Remember, what kids do, cross my heart and hope to die. That's the covenant oath that they're sort of entering into, if you like. And so that's kind of expressed in these animals being split in half and sort of facing each other. And when Abraham has this vision of this firebrand passing in between the 2 halves, this is God's pledge. He says, yep, I sign up to this covenant. I place myself under this oath, under this promise, if you like. So bear this in mind. God is saying that my life is on the line by my faithfulness. Now, notice this. like we're celebrating the Annunciation, right? The Incarnation. God the Son enters into the human family, takes flesh, and enters into the human side of the covenant because he becomes a son of Abraham, a son of Moses. He becomes a son of David, right? He inserts himself into the human side of the covenant. And remember, what is the penalty for covenant unfaithfulness? Death. See where this is going? Jesus is going to take the human side and pay the penalty for covenant unfaithfulness. God's going to do it for us. All right, that should flip your mind out. It does mine. But when you see like all of these covenants being established in blood and in death and all of that sort of stuff, well, that's what's being expressed. We'll see it again, right? I'll have to bring it up. Circumcision, right? So remember the second promise that God makes to Abraham. He says, right, I'm going to make you a father of many nations. Like you're going to have so many descendants, they're going to be like grains of, you're going to have so many descendants and you're going to be the father of a multitude of nations. That's why God changes his name from Abram to Abraham, which means the father of many, the father of many nations. Now, here's the problem, right? At this point, Abraham's 100 years old. And he's like, Father, I haven't got any kids. What are you talking about? And then they sort of concoct this idea of like, oh, you know what? Okay, haven't had kids with my wife, Sarah. Why don't you go to that slave girl over there, who, by the way, is Egyptian? Hagar's her name. Go and have relations with her. You'll have a child by her, and then God will keep his promise to you. You'll become a father that way. You can see that they're manipulating God and they're trying to like sidestep his plans. Part of the reason why, the circumcision then becomes the sign of this covenant with Abraham is that, well, that's the very thing that misbehaved. And so it gets cut. The sign of the covenant is the sign of covenant faithfulness, right? And what is the sign that you place yourself under covenant with God? It's precisely that. It's precisely that circumcision, right? And not only Abraham, but all of his descendants and all of his household as well. So you can kind of see that with covenant comes sacrifice. That with this oath taking comes this kind of shedding of blood. It's kind of like it's kind of strange to our sensibilities, but when you start putting yourself in sort of like the biblical mindset, it's like I can see what's going on here, because blood is life. And when I pour out blood, it becomes the expression of my giving my life, a sign of me being in, boots and all. Good. Last one. Remember the third promise that God gave to Abraham? Listen to this. He says, I swear by my own self, it is the Lord who speaks. Because you have done this, because you have not refused me your son, your only son, I will shower blessings on you. I will make your descendants as many as the stars of heaven and grains of sand on the seashore. Your descendants shall gain possession of the gates of their enemies, and all the nations of the earth shall bless themselves by your descendants as a reward for your obedience. In other words, you and your descendants will become the blessing for all nations. Not just your family, your kin, all the world will be blessed through you, through your line, through your descendants, okay? What was the event that prompted this covenant? The hint was in there. Because you have not refused your son, your only son, It's Isaac, right? So remember, after the second promise, Sarah conceives. She's 90, I think. 90 years old, she conceives. Isaac is born. And then when Isaac's about 12, the angel comes to Abraham and goes, hey, Abraham, take your son, your firstborn, the one that you love, and take him up to Mount Moriah and just sacrifice him there for God. Would you? Would you? Now, it's perhaps one of the most disturbing stories in all of the Bible. But it's disturbing not just because, Abraham's his dad and he's now being asked to sacrifice his son, but also, hang on a second, God. What the heck about your promise? You said that I would become a father of many nations, and here's my son, my only son, my firstborn son, and you're going to take him away from me? All of a sudden, this puts in conflict the very promise that God had made. So what the heck do you do? Well, Abraham, he sets this in motion, slowly. And I'm sure that with every step that he takes, he's like, the Lord's going to put a stop to this. The Lord's going to put a stop to this. The Lord's going to put a stop to this. Right up until that last moment, that's exactly when the Lord puts a stop to this. But notice what happens. That, what has God done? God has tested Abraham. And remember what that test is for. That test is not so that you would fail. That test is so that you would reveal what's truly within you. Well, and it's not even so much that God needed to find this out. I think it's that Abraham needed to find this out. It became a revelation for him as well. And there's this moment where Abraham kind of speaks prophetically. Isaac, God bless him, he's got the wood for the sacrifice, the burnt offering, on his back. And with the wood on his back, he's climbing up Mount Moriah, which is where Jerusalem is, right? And he sort of looks over to his dad and he goes, hey, Dad, so we've got the wood for the sacrifice and we've got the fire for the sacrifice, but where's the sacrifice? Abraham hasn't got the heart, I think, at this point to go, hey, son, actually it's you. And says instead, you know what? God will provide the sacrifice. When the angel then, tells Abraham to put the knife down, we now see how faithful you are. We hear that there's a ram caught by its horns in a thicket nearby. And then the altar which they'd set up and the wood that they'd used, that they brought for the sacrifice, they now use to sacrifice this ram. But there's always this thing hanging out there of you know what? God will provide the sacrifice. God will provide. God will provide. And what we see in this moment, right, okay, Abraham in his great faithfulness now has this, covenant made with him by God that, you will become the blessing for the whole world. Well, how's this going to happen? Because God will provide the sacrifice. He won't ask your firstborn son from your family to be offered. It is God the Father who will give his son in sacrifice, and he will become the blessing for all nations. All right? That Jesus here now is shown to be the fulfillment of this great promise. All right. Cool. All right. Hopefully, as we're kind of hitting these high notes, right, we can start to see what God is doing, right? He's setting up all of these, stories. He's setting up all of these conditions, if you like, that are now going to reappear in the life of Christ and are going to help us to understand what Jesus is doing. And then from the flip side, when we see what Jesus has done, we can look back into the Old Testament and go, oh, so that's who God is. So that's who the Father is. So that's what he's been doing all this time. Right, let's kick on and we'll go into Moses. Now, here's the question. How did Israel end up in Egypt? What the heck are they doing there? Yeah, right, okay. So Abraham, his son's Isaac, and Isaac's son, Jacob. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Now, the thing that can get a little bit confusing is that partway through Jacob's life, God, like he did with Abram and Abraham, changes Jacob's name to Israel, right? Israel, Jacob, got 3 wives, and from those 3 wives, he has 12 sons. And each of those sons will be the beginning of a tribe of Israel. So when you trace back these tribes of Israel, it goes back to one of Jacob's sons. And so a kind of shortcut way of naming all of the descendants that come from Israel, well, you know what? You just call them Israel. Well, everyone who's a son or a daughter of Israel, we'll just call them Israel, right? They get a corporate name altogether. Well, everyone from this tribe, we'll call them Reuben. Everyone from this tribe will call them Levi. Everyone from this tribe will call them Gad or Asher. So, that I always think that's kind of helpful to remember. Now, one of the sons of Israel, Joseph, you've heard of the Technicolor Dreamcoat? Okay, it's not a Technicolor Dreamcoat. He's given this coat, which is described as having long sleeves and going all the way down to the bottom. Now, if you've got a coat that has long sleeves and goes all the way down to the bottom, what is the one thing in that coat that you cannot do? Yeah, no, your sleeves are going to get in the way. Your coat's going to get in the way. You can't work. You can't labour. So it becomes a kind of symbol of authority that Joseph's kind of set in charge of his brothers, and he kind of rubs their noses in it a little bit, and they have a gutful of it, and then, they decide, we'll get rid of Joseph. In the end, he's sold to the Ishmaelites. Now, bear in mind, who are the Ishmaelites? Remember Hagar? Hagar had a son from Abraham, Ishmael. These are old family wounds, right? Sold to the descendants of Ishmael, and then taken to Egypt. Where was Ishmael's mum from? Egypt. Yeah, right. Okay. Egypt as well comes from Ham. Remember Noah? Ham was the one who was cursed, and one of Ham's sons was Egypt. They're all family squabbles, right? Anyway, Joseph, ups, downs, ends up, by, sort of very interesting twists and turns, a man of authority in Pharaoh's court. And he manages to rescue his family finally from a famine which is raging in the land of Canaan, in their own homeland. And so he brings his family, he brings his dad, Israel, Jacob, he brings all of his brothers, and the youngest brother that he hadn't met, Benjamin, brings them all to Egypt. And there they enjoy the favour of the Pharaoh. Because you know what? Joseph's the guy who's kind of rescued the whole kingdom from famine. And he's aces in our book, and here's his family. So they enjoy a period of privilege. But eventually, we hear that there was a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. Now, presumably what happens is there's a dynastic shift. That, one dynasty falls away and a new dynasty rises. And this dynasty, this new Pharaoh, all alliances are off, right? You had your promise with that dynasty over there. I'm not going to honour it now. Think Donald Trump, right? All of a sudden, foreign policy is just, we're going to redo all of this. And we have a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph, who didn't respect the alliance that they entered into. And in the meantime, what do we hear? That these 12 sons have had, through the passing generations, and it's been about 400 years, lots and lots of kids, and now they're strong. And we can't have that. So they start to enslave the people. And that's how Israel ends up in Egypt, and that's how Israel ends up enslaved. Now, one of the things that Pharaoh does is he, in order to kind of ethnically cleanse, if you like, to eradicate the Jewish people or the Israelite people, he says, all right, midwives, any boy that is born of a Hebrew woman, you need to kill. Girls are okay, boys need to go. Now, does that sound familiar? King Herod, Bethlehem. Moses comes into the world much like Jesus comes into the world, right? Remember how history here is echoing? You can see it all over the place. Now, why keep the girls? Presumably, it was a way of trying to disinherit the Israelites, that if the inheritance was passed on to the males, then when the girls grew up, they would have to marry Egyptian men, and it would be the Egyptian men who then inherited the Israelite property and wealth. So it's a way of kind of, taking what belongs to the Israelites. It's quite cunning, very political, power moves, right? Anyway, we hear that when Moses is born, these midwives in Goshen, in this sort of Israelite city in Egypt, these midwives, they don't want to follow, the law of Pharaoh, and so they do a little bit of finagling, and we hear that Moses is rescued because his mother puts together like a little. It's called in Hebrew. It's called an ark. And Moses is placed inside the ark and kind of like pushed down the river, and there is found by the daughter of Pharaoh, and that's where Moses' name comes from. In Hebrew, it means I drew you up out of the water. I pulled you up out of the water. Now, that's kind of important. Because notice, how is it that we are saved from death as Christians? Baptism, right? What is it that God does for us? He pulls us up out of the water. We can see the rhyming pattern here that's going on through history. Right, I pulled you up out of the water. Moses is like this ark, this new beginning, if you like, this new beginning of creation. Cool. All right. He's raised in Pharaoh's court, and obviously raised in a lot of privilege, where the Hebrew people are all suffering. And then we hear this moment where Moses. He sees an Egyptian persecuting an Israelite, and he's so sort of gripped with rage that he kills the Egyptian and sort of hides him in the sand. And it's the Israelites who sort of go, "We know what you did." They don't want to accept him because he's the rich boy. Like, you think you're one of us, you're not one of us. And of course, for the Egyptians, to have killed another Egyptian is a capital crime. So he's going to be on the run. Not accepted by the Israelites, not accepted by the Egyptians. You know what, mate? You're running for your life. Get out and go. So he goes off into the desert areas, into the wilderness, and he goes to the Midianites. Now, the Midianites, they're from the branch of Abraham. So they're kind of like ethnic cousins, if you like. And so, that's where he marries his bride, who's a Midianite, Zipporah. And he's living the life of a shepherd and having a wow of a time. And then he encounters God in the burning bush. Now, when we get into the Exodus, we can pause over these texts and go over them for hours and hours and hours. Like we could talk about the burning bush for hours and hours and hours. We're not going to do that. We're just going to sort of hit some highlights, just to sort of try and pull together the different threads to kind of make our point. But just know that like we're taking a very, very quick glance at some very, very profound passages. But have a look at page 130. Just at the bottom there. One day when Moses was tending Jethro's flock, that's his father-in-law, he drew near to Mount Horeb on the far side of the desert. Now, something to note, Mount Horeb, in Hebrew Horeb means dry. So like Mount Dry, it's a dry area, it's wilderness, it's desert, right? This will come to be known also as Sinai, and Sinai means burning. So presumably, Horeb gets called Sinai because of this event of the burning bush. But those words get used interchangeably. So if you hear about, the prophet Elijah going to Mount Horeb, it's like, he's going to the place where Moses met the burning bush. It's the same spot. God appeared to him in a burning bush and said, Moses, Moses. Moses answered, here I am. Don't come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham. If the voice speaking from the burning bush had stopped there, Moses might not have known which God he faced. As direct descendants of Abraham, Midianites and Ishmaelites worshipped the same God. Remember, they're ethnic cousins. And the Edomites, who descended from Esau, that's Jacob's brother, could have said, he is our God. Even the Egyptians could lay some claim to this God because the first one to bear Abraham a child was Hagar, the Egyptian. But the voice continued, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He narrowed down the family line so that Moses could follow it from Shem to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, and to the 12 tribes of Israel enslaved in Egypt. God had worked in Moses' life to prepare him for this very time, for the time when the promise of deliverance would be fulfilled in the lives of his people. Right. God is, when he refers to himself as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, what's he doing? He's using covenant language, right? Because that's what a covenant is. I'm yours and you're mine. I am the God of your fathers. I'm the one that they have laid claim to, and I am the one who takes possession of them. And so what God is going to enact here is this covenant action of rescuing his people. They need him. God will come to their rescue, right? Cool. There's another interesting little moment too, because remember where Moses comes from. He's coming from Egypt, and Egypt has, a lot of gods, and we'll talk about them in a brief second. And so when Abraham, I keep doing that. When Moses asks, well, who shall I say has sent me? It's kind of an interesting question. It's like, so which one of the gods are you? And what's your name? And God responds, well, here's my name. I am who I am. And it's an interesting answer, right? Because it's a bit of a non-answer. Like, is that your name? It's like, if you name someone, okay, yes, you have the ability to address them, but you also have the ability then to distinguish one from another. Well, if you're that person, it means you're therefore not that person over there. And so if God was to have a name just like Ra or, Apis or Isis or, any of the other Egyptian gods, he's kind of setting himself on the same plane as all of the other gods. Of like, oh yeah, no, I'm not any of those. I'm this one over here. And God's like, I don't play those games. I don't bear a name just like everyone else. I am who I am. And I think that becomes a really important moment, because what does God need to do with the Israelites who've been in Egypt for 430 years? He's going to have to get rid of these stupid idols that they're carrying around with them in their hearts all the time. I'm not one among others. I am who am. I am being. I am existence. But I'm also yours. I'm the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Right? When Moses then goes back, there's this interesting moment about the bridegroom of blood on page 135. It's fascinating. Go read it yourself. But I'm going to skip over it because it's getting late. But famously, right, Moses goes back to Egypt and he's given the mission to set the people free. But he's been given power and authority by God to do it. And God is the one who's right by his side and helping him, right? So if we go to page 137, we start getting into some of these plagues. Now, when we read them, these plagues kind of sound a little bit weird and a little bit random, like frogs and gnats and flies and, locusts and like, what the heck is going on? Well, have a listen to this. The first of the 10 plagues turned the Nile to blood. God wasn't just flexing his muscles and saying, here, watch this, I'll turn this river to blood. The Egyptians worshipped the Nile as a divine entity, identified with the god Hapi. Turning the river to blood meant, for all practical purposes, the slaying of this god. Next came the plague of frogs. As they died and began to stink, God was thereby passing judgment on the Egyptian goddess Heket, often worshipped in the form of a frog. Meanwhile, with each plague, God protected his people in Goshen from harm or loss. What we start to see is this kind of progressive slaying of the Egyptian gods. God of the sun was Ra. What do you get? 3 days of darkness and an eclipse. You see, the locusts, what do? Steal your harvest. The god of the harvest, powerless, dead. So at this point, God is slaying the Egyptian idols, not only for the sake of Pharaoh, but also for the sake of his own people. He's showing them who's boss, but not in the sense of, like, I'm the one that you need to fear because I'm the one who can slay you. No, I'm the one who protects and defends you. It's Goshen, this Jewish, Israelite town, which is rescued in the midst of all of it. Now, the last plague, right? Remember the last plague? The firstborn son of man and beast. Now, Pharaoh is God, according to the pagan religion. So if Pharaoh's son dies, who dies? The Son of God. Right? What did God instruct the Israelites to do? This is the Passover, right? Take the Passover lamb, mark the doorposts and lintel of your house with the blood of the lamb, and as the angel of death comes through the land of Egypt, it will see the blood of the lamb and pass over your household, so that the firstborn son who is inside your household will be saved, will be rescued, right? This is sort of like one of the defining moments for Israelite people, right? Cool. Let's go forward to Jesus. He finishes celebrating the Passover meal with his disciples. What does he do? He goes with his disciples where? To the garden. He goes outside. When you're in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus, it was a walled city, and to be within the walls of Jerusalem was like to be within the household of Israel. Jesus goes outside the walls and over the Kidron Valley to the Garden of Olives, to the Garden of Gethsemane. Who is Jesus? He's the firstborn son of God. And he is now going outside of the household. And who is he going to contend with? Death, the destroyer, right? You see this rhyming pattern coming forward, coming forward, coming forward. He is going to be the lamb. He's going to be the one whose blood will mark the doorposts and lintel that will allow the angel of death to pass over us, right? All of these things are kind of reminiscent, but what we're seeing here is that God is the one who is rescuing his people. He's the one who is establishing covenant, drawing together and bringing into relationship with him, right? That keeps coming over and over and over again. Right. Through the Red Sea, interestingly, as they go through the Red Sea, this is the bit we forget. God rescues the people of Israel by drawing them through the Red Sea dry shod. But then what happens? It covers over the Egyptians. That God is not only going to rescue us from our enemies, he's also going to destroy our enemies. He's going to destroy evil. I always think that's the bit that we forget, and it's good news. God's going to destroy our enemies. But here's the challenge, right? All along, the Israelites are carrying too much of Egypt with them. They're carrying too much of Egypt in their hearts. 3 days after coming through the Red Sea, they can't find water. They start complaining. And they start being suspicious of why God has rescued. Why have you brought us out here just to die of thirst? And then God brings forth water from the rock, right? 6 weeks later, they run out of food. And they're like, why have you brought us out of Egypt where we had plenty of food? Did you bring us out here to starve to death? And then God gives them manna in the desert, right? Like every single time, they're like, why did you save us? Just because you want to kill us out here? They're hard to please. After 3 months, they get to the foot of Mount Sinai, the foot of Horeb, right? And that's where we see this new covenant come about, right? So remember what's happening here. We've had the covenant with our first parents, the covenant with the family of Noah, the covenant with the tribe of Abraham. Now he's going to get together these 12 tribes of Israel and make of them one people. At the moment, they're 12 tribes. They were brothers, and we go back to Israel. But how are we going to become one people, right? Well, God's going to enter into a covenant that is going to be, the thing that binds us together as one, right? Okay. Let's have a quick look at page 147. Halfway down the page. Before God could expect Israel to unify the other nations, he had first to unify them as his own holy nation. We can imagine that God the Father spoke to them of an awesome calling. You will be a kingdom of priests. You won't rule through political power or military strength as the Egyptians do, but through wisdom and righteousness and holiness. Through holy lives and prayer and sacrifice, you will earn the right to be heard and believed and followed. You will draw the nations to return to me freely, but only if you put all your trust in me and meet me face to face and hear me speak my law of love. Right. There we see that sort of mission of pulling together these 12 tribes. If you flip over the page, on the morning of the third day, a thick cloud blanketed the mountain, along with the special effects of thunder and lightning accompanied by a loud trumpet blast, which made everyone tremble. When Moses brought the people to the foot of Mount Sinai to meet God, they saw that it was wrapped in smoke, because the Lord had descended upon it in fire. The mountain quaked. As the trumpet grew louder and louder, God answered Moses in a thunderous voice, repeating his stern warning that no one touch the consecrated summit. Then Moses went up Mount Sinai to meet with God, to receive his word, and to prepare Israel for their reunion with the Father. Moses returned to find the people trembling with fear at the sights and sounds surrounding Mount Sinai. They all pleaded with Moses to speak to God alone, but don't let God speak to us, lest we die. Moses tried to reassure them that they needn't fear their father, who loved them as his own children. He'd come only to test them that they might not sin. The special effects were simply meant as a reminder to God's children that nobody draws near to the Holy One of Israel in safety if they don't approach him in reverence and awe. But still, the people stood at a distance and trembled in fear. Why were the Israelites so frightened? All they basically had to do was shower and wait 3 days and abstain from sexual relations. This was the preparation that Moses had instructed the people of Israel to undertake in order to go into covenant with God. You got to have 3 days, cleanse yourself, abstain from sexual relations, and, make yourself ready. So they didn't have to do terribly much. But why the holy terror? Because they were frail human beings. Apparently, they hadn't followed orders. Perhaps it was that Moses commanded them to forego sex, making it irresistible, like forbidden fruit. In any case, the trembling people fell back and said to Moses, "You go up the mountain alone." And they stood afar off while Moses drew near to the loud roar and thick darkness of God's presence. Once again, God's infinite respect for freedom was manifest. If Israel won't accept the gift of his presence, they must learn how to live with his distance, or else face the accursed prospect of his absence. The fact is, Israel wanted God, but on their own terms, at a safe distance. A wise man once defined diplomacy as the art of letting someone else have your own way, which makes God the consummate diplomat. He would not abandon his children. He only backed as far away as Israel thought safe. As a wise and loving father, he gave them only what they were ready and willing to receive. In effect, he gave them what they thought was necessary to keep them open to eventually receive what he knew they really needed. You kind of get this sense of a sort of push and pull. And I think that's a story we know well in our own spiritual lives as well. They're like, yeah, Lord, let's be friends, but not too close. It's close enough. Thanks very much, Lord. I'm not so sure about what your will is for my life, and I'm not entirely sure that I'm willing to let you control it to that degree. So we'll cooperate, but I'll stay in the driver's seat, right? It all starts to sound rather familiar. And you can kind of see the way that push and pull sort of works. But let's dip into this covenant moment then with Moses. So already we can sense this sort of hesitancy coming from Israel. Something's not quite right here, but have a listen. So here's a quote from the scriptures, Exodus 24, 6-8, page 150. And Moses took half the blood and put it in basins, and half the blood he threw against the altar. He then took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people, and they said, "All that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient." And Moses took the blood and threw it upon the people and said, "Behold the blood of the covenant, which the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words." According to the ancient Hebrew outlook, the symbolic meaning of the blood sprinkling upon both altar and people was twofold. Positively, it symbolized the blood covenant between God and Israel. Negatively, the shed blood signified a solemn curse that Israel placed itself under by swearing the covenant oath. Through this ritual, in effect, Israel declared to God, "Amen, we will share family life with you. You will be our father. We will be your sons, or else we'll be damned." That action then of the sort of sprinkling of blood is this moment of agreement. Moses starts by sprinkling, the blood of these sacrifices on the altar which he's created. And that's the sign of God saying, yep, cross my heart and hope to die. Like, may my blood be spilt if I'm unfaithful to the covenant. And then Moses reads the book of the covenant to the gathered people. Right, here's what it means to live in relationship with God. Here are the rules. Here are the commandments, if you like. This is what it will be for us to belong to him. And all the people go, yep, aces. We've read the fine print. We'll be faithful to God. And that's when Moses flings the blood on the people. And so you can kind of see this one blood uniting now the altar and the people, God and his people. We are now of one blood. And there we see this establishing, this uniting of this people in a covenant relationship with God. I'm yours, you're mine. I'm the God of Abraham, the Isaac of Jacob. I am your God. You're my people. And the way that you demonstrate your faithfulness, the way that you demonstrate that you are my people, is by following my law. This book of the covenant, right? Now, this bit's actually quite important. I'll continue reading the paragraph. At the father's invitation, Moses then accompanied Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and the 70 elders up the mountain. Remember that the Sinai is the sacred mountain. No one's allowed to come up there. Well, he's now bringing elders up there in the covenant. Despite the sin of the people, Scripture says that the Lord didn't raise his hand against these leaders as they saw God and ate and drank before him. They go up the mountain and what do? They have a banquet, right? From the ancient Hebrew perspective, covenant meals like this conveyed a twofold symbolic meaning of the intimate family ties between covenant parties and the awesome responsibilities that both parties assumed. The meal was a sign of the covenant blessing of communion, while the sacrificial victims signified the covenant curse that would befall Israel if they went back on their sworn oath. A similar twofold meaning is also present in the Holy Eucharist, which Jesus instituted to be the sign of the new covenant as both a sacrifice and a meal, which the Passover and the Sinai covenant ritual both foreshadow. The message of Sinai was clear. Throughout all of Israel, God wanted every tent to be a tabernacle, every hearth an altar, every father a priest, every firstborn son a deacon, and every family a domestic church. And the nation was to be a kingdom of priests, if only they would forsake the idols of Egypt and place their wholehearted trust in God. Right. Notice what's happened, right? We've had the Passover sacrifice, that 10th plague in Egypt. We've now found ourselves at the foot of Mount Sinai, entered into a blood covenant with God, and now these elders have been brought up to share communion with God, brought into his holy presence and have a banquet. And the banquet is that outward sign and expression, a celebration of intimacy. That celebration of the fact that we have been brought together and we are now one family. It's the family table. Now, the point that Scott Hahn here makes is, okay, well, both of these things are now taken up into the Eucharist because what do? Well, there we have the Passover sacrifice, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. And how do we celebrate? How do we live out that newly established intimacy and covenant with God? We dine. We have a meal. We have a banquet. And even this banquet, this sacramental sign, is a foretaste of the true banquet that we're going to experience in eternity. The priest holds up the host and says, "Behold the Lamb of God, behold him who takes away the sins of the world. Blessed are those who are called to the supper of the Lamb." The wedding banquet, the feast of eternity. Right? Just like these 72 elders get pulled up onto Mount Sinai in order to experience this unity, this oneness with God, so too we are now drawn through the sacrament into this new life, this new intimacy and communion with God. Cool. All right. Have you got like 5 more minutes left in you? I want to talk about a golden calf. Quick calf. All right. I know. We've covered a lot of territory today. All right. Have a look at page 151. So Moses has gone up with these elders, and here we go. After partaking of this ritual meal with the elders, Moses ascended the mountain again, this time to fast for 40 days and 40 nights. There the Father spoke to Moses about many important family matters, how to build the ark, the tabernacle, the altars, and there were precise specification. Aaron, all of these different instructions that God's given. Right. Unfortunately, things weren't going so well at the foot of the mountain. Impatient with Moses' delay, the Israelites took matters into their own hands. They besieged Aaron with an urgent request. Up, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what's become of him. Notice that it was no longer God who had brought them out, but Moses. And the people were all too ready to cast their erstwhile leader aside. Not to worry. Moses had left his brother to cover for him. Surely Aaron would rebuke these unruly ingrates, right? Wrong. Can you imagine standing against hundreds of thousands of determined idol worshippers? Maybe Aaron thought he could somehow pull this one out of the fire if he just went along with the crowd. Sometimes it's easier to be a lemming than a leader. Whatever thoughts raced through his mind, Aaron instructed the people to bring all their fine jewelry. Then he proceeded to melt the gold and fashion an idol in the shape of a bull calf, just like the idol worshipped in the form of a bull calf by the Apis cult in Egypt. It was also just like the bullocks Moses had required Israel to sacrifice and eat a short time ago. So much for renouncing the idols of Egypt. I think that's the first important point. This golden calf didn't come from nowhere. It was like, oh, you know what? Let's just make a calf and pretend like that's a god. No. They're going back to Egypt and they're remembering the gods of Egypt. Now, what the heck are the people thinking? They've been rescued from slavery in Egypt. They've gone through the Red Sea. They've had miraculous water springing up for them. They've been fed with manna in the desert. But what's happened? They've ended up at the foot of Mount Sinai. They've heard all of these, peals of thunder, and they're sort of like, whoa. God, you stay a little bit away, right? There's some fear that's sort of arisen. They enter into this covenant, but there's something that's not quite right. Moses goes back up the mountain, and 40 days, it's a long time, right? After a couple of weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, where is this guy? What the heck's going on? You know what? That big angry God probably killed him. That big angry God up on Mount Sinai is probably, in which case, you know what? We might be next. Maybe what God did is lure us out of Egypt precisely so that he could slaughter us all here at the foot of Mount Sinai. You know what? We need protection. We need a defender. Let's get one of those gods from Egypt to come and protect us against that one. It starts to sound a little bit more familiar. It starts to become a little bit more plausible because all of a sudden it's like, really? Within a month, you're going to turn on him? You just entered into a covenant. What's going on underneath? There's also this about the cult of Apis. Listen to this. At one level, it's hard to understand how Israel could have reverted so quickly. Yet, at another level, it shouldn't be that difficult. Think about it. How do you explain the powerful fascination people always had with gold, from ancient times to the present? Gold is a timeless symbol of wealth and beauty. And what about the sign value of the bull calf? Even today, we can see it as a sign connoting youthful power and sexual virility. If you put it all together, what do you get? In effect, Israel reverted to the idols of money, sex, and power in the Egyptian form. The people were delighted. They proclaimed, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt." So Aaron built an altar in front of the calf and announced that a festival would be held the next day in honor of Yahweh. Notice the slight shift in Aaron's words as to which God was to be worshipped. The next day, Israel rose early, this, proclaimed feast day, to sacrifice burnt offerings and present peace offerings to their idol. Then they sat down to eat and drink and, quote, rose up to play. The last phrase is a Hebrew euphemism for the impure behavior associated with ancient fertility cults, namely a sexual orgy such as the Egyptians had while worshipping their bull idol Apis. Right. There you go. It's not just they made a golden calf. They fell completely back into those pagan rituals, and those pagan rituals which were deeply immoral. And, remember where we've come from in this covenant language talk. Like, we started with this first covenant with Adam and Eve of faithful love, and where have we ended up? In, this sort of like random orgiastic kind of, unfaithfulness. That's how things have fallen apart. Now, here's the problem. What did Israel say? They said, you know what? We know the book of the covenant. We've heard the law. We will be faithful to it. Or else, what? We'll be damned. We put our blood on the line. And now Moses comes back and he's like, uh-oh. What should rightly happen in this moment? They should all be mowed down. And God is the one who says, Moses, I've got some bad news for you. Things aren't going so well down there. They've done what they said they wouldn't do, and that was apostatize, be unfaithful to me. And Moses then does some very symbolic actions. He takes the 2 stone tablets, the 10 Commandments, and he breaks them into little pebbles. Now, why does he do that? Because that's what you did. I'm just showing you what you've done in your hearts. You've broken it to smithereens, right? And then what does he do? He grinds up the golden calf into dust, puts it in the water, and he makes the people drink it. Now, what do you think he's saying by that? Where does it end up? That's what I think of your God. Yeah, that's what I think of your God. That's what I think of your gold. It's nothing. It belongs in the sewer, And so Moses has these couple of moments of this is what the reality is of the covenant that you have now made, the reality that you have made of the covenant. Moses then says, okay, who here is going to be faithful to God? And it's the Levites who put their hand up and go, yeah, you know what? We're going to be faithful to God. And it's the Levites then who pick up swords and then start killing. Each Levite kills 3 people. A brother, what is it? A brother, a something and something. Anyway, there are several thousand who die. Now, admittedly, it should have been all of them, but it's the Levites who are willing to be faithful to the covenant. Now, here's the thing. They're actually being faithful to the covenant. Does God respect the covenant by saying, oh, you know what, don't worry about it, we'll just forget this ever happened? It's no, that doesn't respect the free choices that they've made. If you like, what happens is you get a kind of suspended sentence. All right, suspended sentence, we'll continue on, but there's still a problem that needs solving. Jesus, he'll be the one to resolve this great problem where he himself will take upon himself the unfaithfulness of the people, and he himself will receive the penalty of unfaithfulness, even though he is the only one who is truly faithful. So let's pause there, golden calf, and we'll pick up next week. Next week we'll go from the golden calf through the wilderness into the promised land, and then we'll head into David and that final covenant. And after that, we're going to get into Jesus. We've been sort of sprinkling some of the snippets throughout of how these covenants find their fulfillment in Christ, but we'll have a proper treatment when we get to the sixth covenant. So we've got from chapter 9, we'll do 9 and 10. 9 and 10. All right. How are we feeling? Done. Full. Exhausted. Yeah. I took a long time going over what we've done, and hopefully that wasn't boring for you. Yeah, I'd like to sort of keep us on track as to where we're headed, and hopefully keep an eye on the relevance of what we're talking about and why it matters. So, good.
We might have to read chapter 8 because Father Alec only told us to read chapter 6 and 7.
Oh, so Father Alec told you 6 and 7. Yeah, okay, read chapter 8.
That's why we all looked a bit bemused.
You're all looking at me bemused. Yeah. But it's hopefully if you read chapter 8, you'll have a few little toe holds of what we've spoken about tonight. Good. If you need to go. But if anyone has a question, yeah.
Sorry.
Speak now or forever hold your peace.
No question, just saying that there were many
Microphone.
Many thoughts, there were gaps that were connected.
A lot of gaps connected. Yeah, look, I think it's helpful to constantly sort of go back from Jesus back to the old, from Jesus back to the old, and vice versa. Because, yeah, otherwise it just sounds like, some interesting biblical tidbits. But, like, why does this matter for us? That's important. Yeah, good. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, everyone online. God bless you. Happy feast day for whatever's left. This isn't a day of Lent. When you get a solemnity, you get a day off. So, Yes. You mean you missed St. Patrick and you missed St. Joseph? Oh, you know what? You've got 3 days. You've got 3 days credit. Good. All right. Thanks, everyone.